Welcome to the Manifestation Lab. This is your host, Kelly Howe. From the grounded science to the mystical and unseen, we're investigating this big experiment we call life and finding what really works when it comes to manifesting a life that sets your heart and your soul on fire. Welcome to the lab. All right, Jeff Tarrant, let's do this. Good to see you.
Yeah, it's good to see you too.
Yeah.
Been forever.
You're up to a lot of really cool stuff, which is why I wanted to talk to you. And we just always have a great time chatting about like what's new in psychology. And so tell me a little bit, what are you working on right now? I mean, like a million things. I can tell by looking online. I'm like, oh my gosh, I made notes about things to talk about. And I guess we could start with the Neuromeditation Institute. What's going on with that?
Yeah, so really that got started when I moved out here to Oregon. So almost immediately. And kind of what happened was we got out here and started, set up shop to see clients. And, the accountant said, well, you need to close down what you had in Missouri and just start over, with a new,
and that's so
name,
easy.
a new tax ID. And it was like, okay.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was like, Neuromeditation Institute, that sounds good. And one thing has led to another, and so really what's happened is that what started out as really just combining neurofeedback with meditation for specific styles of meditation has really grown into something a lot bigger where we've got, a whole certification program and, online classes and training using technology and research, so really that's taking up most of my time, which is great. It's been really fun. Just things have just sort of organically developed and morphed, and they continue to do so. The pandemic, put a wrinkle in things. We were planning on opening a big center, kind of like a yoga studio where we would have classes all day long with different styles of meditation and using different technology. And that was supposed to happen right when the pandemic hit. And so obviously we kind of put a pin in that and said, well, let's hang on. And so things became focused online for obvious reasons. And that's actually been really great for us because turns out we have a lot of interest from folks in Canada and Germany in particular.
That's cool.
So offering things online makes it accessible to a much wider audience. So we've kind of pivoted in that direction of doing more online, training rather than just focused on our center here. Yeah.
So you mentioned the 4 styles of meditation. And when I got your book, and it is called Meditation Interventions to Rewire the Brain, Integrating Neuroscience Strategies for ADHD, Anxiety, Depression, and PTSD, which is like totally up my alley, right? Because I'm always trying to figure out when somebody comes into me and their state is X, Y, or Z, like what is the best path to take them as far as what's right for their system. And when I started flipping through your book and reading it, I was like, oh my God, this is my soapbox, because I feel like so many times people have this idea of what meditation is, right? And they're like, okay, I've heard this is good. I've heard it works. I'm going to go sit down and be quiet and clear my mind. And then 4 seconds later, they're like irritable and feel like they're doing it wrong. And then they're like, oh, this isn't for me. And they get up and walk away. Right. And like, I've totally been that person, which I think this is why this is my soapbox. And when I started flipping through your book, I was like, oh, holy cow, this is everything that people need to hear, because if we have different states of being, there is not a one size fits all. And you talk about that so much in your book. So maybe talk about the 4 styles and like what might be right for different people.
Yeah. So really what happened was when we started really investigating this, sort of figured out that, researchers have been studying how meditation impacts the brain for quite a while now, and we know a lot. And one of the things that stands out is that depending on how you're using your attention and directing your intention, it affects the brain differently, which sounds so obvious when you say it like that. But for some reason, we tend to still have the idea that meditation is like one thing
Mm-hmm.
or somehow all meditations have the same effect on the brain. And it's like, why would it? Why would a focus practice have the same effect as a loving kindness practice?
Right.
You're doing different things. And so really what we've done is kind of looked at all that research and then sort of taken that information and applied it to mental health. Because obviously, if your brain is being impacted in different ways, there's different implications for mental health.
Mm-hmm.
Because different kinds of concerns impact your brain differently. So really what we've done is just, in some ways, we can't take credit for kind of our entire system, because really what we're doing is taking what other people have done and kind of putting it together in a way that is kind of more user friendly.
Yeah, absolutely.
And, so the four primary styles that we talk about, and I'm going to use the names that we use. We tried to come
Mm-hmm.
up with user friendly names, because if you look in the research, some of the names they use are confusing. And researchers still use a bunch of names to talk about the same thing. One researcher will call it one thing and another researcher will call it another thing.
Right. To add to the confusion.
Right. It's like, and so we've tried to kind of pick some names and define them really clearly, like this is what we're talking about. And so the four styles that we focus on are focus, mindfulness, open heart, and quiet mind. And if you want me to give a brief kind of description of each
Yeah.
one.
If you would, that would be awesome.
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, and again, we tried to pick names that were fairly obvious, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, so it doesn't take a whole lot of mental work to figure out what we're talking about. But so focus practices would be exactly what it sounds like, any kind of concentration practice where you're directing your attention primarily to one thing, your breath, a mantra, an image of the Buddha. It doesn't really matter, really.
Mm-hmm.
Because the idea is that you're holding your attention on one thing, not getting caught up in a bunch of narrative about your own life and your own story. You're just staying focused on this singular thing. And then when you get distracted, you bring it back. It's kind of the basic approach that most people have tried or have heard about. And what's interesting about that practice is that even though it's very simple sounding, it's obviously not simple to do.
Right.
It
Definitely
actually, it has this sort of counter effect where it's activating certain parts of the brain, because you're having to sustain your attention on one thing, and that requires activation.
not.
And so you're actually turning on your frontal lobes
Okay.
in that practice. And at the same time, you're turning off other parts of your brain that have to do with you thinking about yourself and kind of ruminating about your own situation. So even though it's a really simple practice, it's super powerful.
Yeah. So talk to me a little bit about like, what's the benefit for people going, okay, so if I do this type and I activate my frontal lobe and deactivate these other areas, what does that do for us?
Right. So it's interesting because, we talk about focus as being particularly good for things like frontal lobe development. So if you have ADHD, or if you've got working memory problems, or you've had a traumatic brain injury, or age-related cognitive decline, things like that, right? Where you're wanting to kind of give your frontal lobes a little boost, because we know that the brain is plastic, that it's adaptive. It will respond to what you do, to how you exercise it. And so in this context, you're exercising those frontal lobes. You're kind of getting them to engage. And so, so on the surface, it's well, not just the surface, even when you look at the research, it's clear that this style is best for any kind of cognitive goal. If you're trying to improve your cognitive functioning, this is the ideal meditation strategy. But what's funny about it is it's also good for anxiety and depression.
Okay.
Because you're directing your attention to something neutral and minimizing all of your other thoughts. And so again, if you just kind of like think that through, it's like, oh, well, of course, right? Because if you're anxious or depressed, the thoughts tend to be stuck on things that are negative or anxiety arousing or whatever. And so you're learning to shift to something neutral. Your breath is neutral generally, right? It's not great. It's not terrible. It's just your breath.
It's just your breath. Yeah.
And so learning to shift your attention away from the things that are troubling is another, it's kind of like a superpower, right? You know, because people tend to get stuck in those patterns of just repeating the same thoughts over and over that keep them stuck. So it's funny because focus is, it's so basic, but again, when you break it down, it's like, oh, well, gosh, well, no wonder it's good for so many things, right? It's like you're actually challenging a variety of networks in the brain just with this one simple exercise. And so, you know, we talk about it kind of like weight training. You know, I mean, your brain's kind of like a muscle in this regard. And so if you want to get more adaptive and more flexible, then you have to practice changing the sort of habitual ways that the brain behaves.
Sure.
And this is a great way to do it.
Yeah. So you're like lifting the mental muscle that just focuses on something neutral, and you're kind of taking those neural pathways into a new focus, right? With this neutral attention. So I know this seems like an obvious question, but what kind of cognitive goals are you talking about?
So, you know, well, I mean, again, real sort of like basic, like being able to pay attention. I mean, this is
Just
sort of
okay. So for ADHD, this would be a good one.
totally right.
Awesome. Okay.
And so actually this gets us to a good point too, because one of the things we've found is that very often the style of well, I'd say almost always, the style of meditation that's going to help people achieve their goals is often the most difficult one for them. So, and this is a great example, right? It's like, okay, you have ADHD, you can't pay attention. So what should I do? Pay attention.
Right.
You know, and we know that that's the way the brain learns and grows, but it also changes the way you think about meditation, because people will often say, well, just pick something that's comfortable and do that. And again, it's like, if you think it through, it's like, well, if it's comfortable, that means you already know how to do it.
Yes, absolutely. I tell people that when they come in my office, I'm like, this is not easy work, but it's because we're challenging the way that you operate, and we're trying to, you know, create something new. So it's totally, I understand that, like the discomfort with, I need to do something different so that I can experience that difference and start to train myself in that way. Makes so much sense.
Right.
Yeah.
So what we, you know, one of the concepts we talk about a lot is kind of like a developmental approach, because it's also true, right? That if we take somebody with ADHD and say, sit here and focus on your breath, that's not likely to go anywhere. You know, they're going to sit there and daydream or think about whatever, and they're actually not meditating. They're just daydreaming. And so from a developmental perspective, what we try to do is kind of meet people where they're at and say, okay, well, you're not going to be able to sit and focus on your breath. So what can I give you? What kind of strategies can I give you to make this a little more engaging so that you can be successful? So in some ways, we're kind of cheating a little bit, right? But it's like, we call it scaffolding. We're building scaffolding around the practice so to support the person so that they'll actually do it and have some success. And then just like scaffolding on a building, once it's stable, then we can take that away, right? But it's like, why throw somebody into the deep end?
Yes.
When they're going to go like, I can't do this.
Totally. And then they just feel, I think it's like, it's just that shame spiral, because they're like, this is supposed to make me feel better. There must be something wrong with me. Why can't I do this? And I'm out, right? Like I'm never coming back. So yeah, you're totally speaking my language. So, okay. I love that, because I have so many of my clients do struggle with ADHD type stuff. So I wanted to talk to you about that specifically. So what is the next style that you wanted to talk about?
Yeah. So mindfulness, and this is a tricky one, right? Because, you know, in our culture right now, we're using the term mindfulness to mean everything. And actually, even in the research literature, people talk about this. They're like, mindfulness is like 20 different things. So
I've even come across that in the research that I do, that, you know, talking about the researchers talking about how we don't even have a great way to explain this because everybody's all over the board with it. Yeah. And I'm like, well, that does not help me. So
it does not help. And so we debated using that term, but we decided to use it on purpose, and just defining it as clearly as we could. And so really we kind of use, you know, John Kabat-Zinn's definition, you know, that most people are familiar with, you know, from MBSR, right? You know, so, you know, paying attention in the present moment, non-judgmentally, basically, right? So it's any kind of practice where you are exactly tuned into the present moment, but you're not grasping for things that you like, and you're not pushing away things you don't like. You're just accepting what is right now. So your thoughts, your feelings, your body sensations, just allowing them to be there, whatever they are, without
Mhm.
attachment.
It
And
sounds like would you call that like a surrender practice then? We're just,
there's an element of surrender, I think, in it. We would kind of put, it depends on how you want to define surrender, right? So we have to
sure,
define
sure, sure.
surrender, because we could stick surrender in some other styles as well, depending on how we want to define it. But certainly there's an element of surrender in that you're not grasping onto concepts or feelings, which I think most people aren't aware that they even do that. And we all do
Mhm.
that constantly.
Yeah.
I like something, so I'm going to do whatever I can to keep it. And I don't like something, so I'm going to do whatever I can to get away with it. And we're constantly making those adjustments that we're not even aware we're doing, which means we're not being present.
Mhm.
I'm here, instead of just being, and I see so many people that have a really hard time being embodied, being truly in their body.
Yes.
Like
Yes.
people who actually have no awareness of their body. And again, that's sort of that's one of those kind of indicators is like, mindfulness would probably be a good practice, right?
Yes.
And
Definitely.
so mindfulness tends to be in particular good for stress and anxiety, so that's actually pretty consistent with what people think, right? Because even like mindfulness based stress reduction, it's in the name. And the reason that it's so good for stress and anxiety is because of that orientation, right? You're actually learning to step back from what you're experiencing and not get sucked into it. And which is exactly what happens with stress and anxiety. You've got a thought and you get attached to it. In fact, we talk about worry sometimes as being just repeating the same thought over and over and over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like, if you can step back from it and sort of see it for what it is and let it go, it's like, well, that's the remedy. And so, so mindfulness is really a perfect counterbalance for stress and anxiety. And personally, I find mindfulness to be one of the hardest styles. I mean, all of us have our tricky ones, but just allowing things to be as they are is actually really tough.
Yes, it's so hard. I mean, I feel like the last couple of years have been like the biggest test in that area, just going like, all of this is going on and there's just nothing we can do except accept it and be present and keep working through whatever crap comes up. Cause I don't know about you, but woo, it like brought it all up, right? Laid it all on the table.
Yeah. I mean, everybody's anxiety has been sky high the last few years. And, of course that takes a massive toll, right? Because you've got sort of this chronic stress that there's no solution for. Nothing you do is going to make any difference. And, we can only sustain that so long before it starts having significant consequences for our physical and mental well-being, I mean.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about this too, because from my perspective, it just seems like the nature of everything that's happened, there's just been so many different elements that I feel like have kind of blanketly triggered everyone's old trauma. Are you seeing that too? Like, it just feels like it's like whatever hasn't been dealt with for everyone, it somehow this pandemic and what we've been through has just triggered all of it. It's just like all of it's like boom on the table. Are you seeing that?
Yeah, totally. And it's interesting because I see, and you hear people talk about this, certainly I see some people that it's like they've gotten massively triggered and their symptoms have become so strong that they're really struggling, to just sort of get through the day.
Mm-hmm.
And then I've also seen people where they've been triggered and stuff comes up, but it's become an opportunity to resolve those things and to really work with things that maybe they didn't have to before because the rest of their life was good enough that
I
they could
agree.
sort of like scoot by, right? But it's like, but this has kind of forced the issue.
Yeah,
And
I would say that's how it was for me too. It was kind of like, ooh, I'm gonna have to look at that. I didn't realize that was a thing, but here it is. So let's go for it.
yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's been really interesting. Could you give an example? I know in your book you go through like each of the different styles and you talk about like specific practices for each of them. But if somebody's listening to this mindfulness and they're like, okay, this is me, what's like one of the different ways that somebody could sit down right now and just start practicing that?
Yeah. And so, mindfulness is interesting, again, because there's so many ways that you can practice mindfulness, sort of formally and informally, and, structured and unstructured. And so usually at the beginning, and actually MBSR does this, they start with like a body scan, which is sort of a structured mindfulness exercise.
And
Your
remind me what MBSR stands for. Did I say that right?
mindfulness-based stress reduction.
Okay.
Yeah. And it's like an 8-week structured group that kind of teaches some basic skills, but it provides a format, right, to kind of walk you through some different experiences. Now the tricky thing is that some of what they do in there isn't just mindfulness, right? According to our categorization, they do a little bit of everything, which isn't necessarily bad, but it just makes it tricky when we're kind of using this kind of way of thinking about meditation. But one of the first exercises they do is a body scan, where somebody's guiding you toward noticing and being present with whatever is happening in each part of your body as you kind of go through it. And so that's a nice structured way, right? So starting with the body is often a great way to start because the body has to be in the present moment. The body can't be in the future and it can't be in the past. It's like, well, here's your body right here, right now. And so if you're tuning into what's happening in the body, it forces you to be present. So for a lot of people, we recommend starting with the body, starting with something that's structured because it's an easier way than just somehow noticing everything that's happening in the moment, which is, it's overwhelming. It's too hard to do. So kind of, zeroing in, kind of that scaffolding idea, right? Like, let's pick something that's doable. The one caveat that I would say is, for people who have a lot of unresolved trauma that might be in their body, this can be triggering.
Okay, that was what I was going to ask about next. I actually love that about your book because you have each of the styles and then you have the contraindications also, meaning like this might not work for X, Y, and Z. And so I'm glad you mentioned that. How would you, like, if somebody has had a lot of trauma and they're kind of trying to figure out, like, is this right for me? What recommendations do you have?
Yeah, great question. And, so like our 4 styles, and we talk about different concerns, and we don't put PTSD or trauma in any of the categories. And we do that on purpose because, they could all be good. They could all be useful.
Sure.
And there's so much individual variability in how trauma is processed and demonstrated for each person that it really has to be something that you look at on an individual basis. So from our perspective, all of the styles offer something beneficial for people with a trauma history. And all of the styles can be potentially triggering for somebody with a trauma history.
It's kind of like the positive and negative of meditation, right? It's like it can trigger us into that, which is great because we do actually need to heal it, but you can become dysregulated and can be scary and re-traumatize ourselves too.
Exactly. And so, so what we try to do is, we take sort of a trauma informed approach to meditation. So we don't say you shouldn't do this one because you have a trauma history. It's more like providing informed consent and letting people know, like, hey, if you have a trauma history, we're going to try this exercise. You might find this challenging. And if it's challenging to the point that you feel like you can't work with it, or it's more than you have resources for today, here are some alternatives. Here's some options. Here's some ways you can modify this. Because what we want is for people to take control of their own process, their own experience, which actually becomes a mindfulness practice in and of itself. Can you have enough awareness of what's happening for yourself in the moment that you can then make sort of wise decisions about what you need right now? Some days it's not the right day for that.
Right.
Some days it's like, okay, I'm going to hang in here and see if I can sit with this for a minute and see what this, see what's behind this.
Like baby steps and empowerment, right?
Totally.
Like I can do this. I can notice how I'm feeling. I can make the choice to either do this today or not, or try something different.
Right. And actually that by itself can be really useful, right? That it's like recognizing it's like, oh, I don't have to sit here and feel horrible. I have skills, right? And so teaching grounding skills, or if you taught them some EFT stuff or what,
Sure.
they have some tools that they can say, oh, wait a minute, I don't want to be here right now and I don't have to. I can actively get out of this. And then when I'm ready, I can go dip my toes back in the water again. And so, kind of helping people find that balance and kind of learn that ability.
Hmm.
Which again, that by itself, you're rewiring the brain. You're sort of breaking out of the old patterns
Sure.
into something different.
Right. Okay. I like that. So what's the third style?
Third style is open heart. And so in the research, you're mostly going to see things like loving kindness and compassion meditation practices. And so that is encompassed in this kind of umbrella term. And so really we chose a broader term because we also wanted to recognize that meditation practices that involve things like gratitude or forgiveness, that there's a commonality between all of these things. And so, the commonality is that it's like you're actively engaging a positive emotional state. I mean, that's kind of the basics of it, right? Like all of these things, you're actively cultivating some sort of positive feeling. And then usually you're doing something with that energy, right? So I'm sending it to you, or I'm sending it to a loved one, or I'm giving it to myself or to my inner child or whatever. But you're doing something with that energy, which again is what makes it a little bit different from some of the other styles where, you might do a focused meditation and you might feel joy at the end. But that's kind of like a lucky byproduct. You weren't trying to cultivate joy.
Hmm.
That wasn't sort of part of the mission, right?
Yeah.
And so because you're activating positive emotions, that activates other brainwave areas. In fact, this is an interesting one because with open heart practices, there's actually no areas of the brain that are being deactivated.
Interesting.
Yeah. And again, it's different than what people imagine, right? They think of meditation as being like, oh, it's all slow brain waves, theta and alpha and whatever. And that's just not true. So for open heart, it's actually mostly gamma, the fastest brain wave. You see
Interesting.
these big increases of gamma kind of all over the place. So it's a very activating practice.
Okay. I think this is a great place. Could you talk to us a little bit about the different brain waves? Because I know, so Jeff does so much research in brain waves and how that affects different areas of the brain. Can you talk to us a little bit about those different types? I
Sure.
mean, in layman's terms.
Of course.
Dumb it down for me just a little bit.
Yeah. So, your brain is cranking out a ton of electricity kind of all the time, everywhere. And, that's what brainwaves are. It's electricity. And so really it measuring that is the same as measuring any kind of electricity. It's the same language, it's the same concepts. And really there's two concepts in kind of measuring electricity. One is the speed of the electricity. So, the electricity coming out of your wall socket, if you're in North America, is 60 hertz. So that's 60 cycles per second. It's the speed of the electrical current, right? So there's 60 repetitions in 1 second of time. Okay, so that's one way to measure electricity. And, your brain makes 1 hertz, and it makes 2 hertz, and 3 hertz, and 10 hertz, and 20 hertz, and 30 hertz. So your brain makes this huge range of frequencies. In fact, we don't even know how high it goes. Most of our equipment can only go up to about 80 hertz. But we know that it goes faster than that. We just can't even measure it.
Wow.
So, there's a lot we don't know, right? So the other way of measuring brain waves is how big each of those waves are. So it's power or amplitude. And so that's measured in microvolts, so how much of something there is. So we can simplify that whole process by clustering the frequencies into little groups. So instead of saying 1 hertz, 2 hertz, 3 hertz, whatever, we can say, oh, there's delta and theta and alpha. And what those terms are just little clusters. So like delta is taking 1 hertz, 2 hertz, 3 hertz, 4 hertz, and putting it all together into a little group. So they're the slowest brain waves. And then the next ones are theta, which are a little faster. So 4 to 8 hertz. And then there's alpha, which is kind of in the middle, right? It's 8 to 12 hertz. And then we get into beta. And there's a lot of different ways you can slice and dice beta. Some people will just consider beta, 12 to 30 hertz, which is a really big range.
A big span, yeah.
That's a big span. And what most researchers and neurofeedback folks will do is kind of break it into smaller clusters. So you'll see beta 1, beta 2, beta 3.
Okay. I wasn't sure what that was. Okay.
Yeah, they're just kind of breaking it up into smaller chunks, right? And then at the fastest end is gamma, and that's usually around 40 hertz. Again, people define this all over the board. For some people, it's 35 to 80 hertz. For some people, it's 40 hertz. So 40 hertz seems to be, everybody agrees on that. But then it's like, how big of a range around that number? And so each of these brain waves, we have all of these brain waves all the time, everywhere, which is different than what most people sort of imagine, right? Because you hear things like, oh, this is an alpha thing, whatever, right? It's an alpha meditation. And it kind of conveys this idea that your brain is just making alpha. And the reality is your brain's still doing the other stuff too, but maybe it's making more alpha. So it's kind of like a relative distribution. How much alpha is there compared to the other stuff?
Okay.
Right? And so if alpha goes way up and everything else just kind of stays where it's at, it changes the dynamic.
So we always kind of have, or maybe not always, but we have this like soup of different brain waves going on. It's just like some of them are amplifying and growing, and some of them might be dialing down.
Totally. Actually, a really good analogy. I like that. I like that soup analogy.
All right.
I'm gonna have to
I just had a visual of it, actually. Yeah. I was like, oh, I get it.
I'm gonna have to make a slide out of that.
Yeah.
Presentation, a soup slide.
Soup,
yeah. Another analogy that I like is thinking of light. And so if you think of like a white beam of light, and you run that white beam of light through a prism, and then you get a rainbow out the other side. And so the reality of what that means is that, because, backing up one step, all of those colors are different frequencies. Red is a different frequency than yellow, and yellow is a different frequency than blue, but they're all contained in that white beam of light. You just don't know it until you filter it. And so the prism is like a filter. So your brainwaves are the same way. If I stuck one electrode on your head, we would just get this one little squiggle line. And that's like the white beam of light. And so contained within that little squiggle line is a whole rainbow. And the rainbow is like delta, theta, alpha, beta, whatever.
Yeah.
And so you can imagine, kind of using your soup analogy, that each of those colors of the rainbow, some of them are bigger than others, right? So maybe they're not evenly spaced. Maybe your red is way bigger than your blue.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of what happens with your brain moment to moment, right? Is these colors are shifting in, how much there is in relation to the others.
I think that light analogy is so helpful to be able to think about it that way. And this actually brings me to a question that I was like, am I going to ask this? Because I don't want to go too far off on a tangent, but when I was flipping through your book there, you started talking about when someone has a lot of suppressed trauma, and there can be this like layer of theta, if I'm remembering this right, there's like a layer of theta, and then it's active kind of above that. Could you talk about that at all? I mean, I'm just so interested in that as far as like applying it to the work that I do. Would you call that like a dissociated state, or what's going on there?
Yeah. So going back to the kind of the brain waves and just a real quick description of some of them. So delta, is the slowest brain wave. And when you have a lot of delta, you're probably unconscious, right? So like deep sleep, right, is like delta. Or if there's damage to a part of the brain and it's just not working, you're probably going to get a bunch of delta activity there. So delta is kind of like the unconscious, right? It's like it's completely separate from your conscious awareness. You can think of theta as like subconscious. So theta is like where we go in hypnosis, right? Or like when you're starting to fall asleep and you get weird images in your brain and all kinds of stuff like that. That's theta, right? Or it can be a very creative state. So artists often have a lot of theta, right? Because they can see things, right? That are like, how did you come up with that? How did you, you know? And so this subconscious material. And so theta is also associated with memory. So when you are encoding memories or you're pulling out memories, theta is involved. So theta, of course, somebody who's had a trauma history, theta might be impacted, right? Because you've got these memories and it's had an impact on your subconscious way of feeling about yourself and the world. So a lot of times what you'll see is there's sort of elevated theta. It's kind of working extra hard, right? There's a lot of stuff going on down there.
Okay.
So alpha is the next one, and I'm going to skip it for a second and come back.
Okay.
Because then we go to beta, and beta is like your conscious mind. It's like, I'm thinking, I'm processing, I'm analyzing, I'm whatever, right? And so if you know, what you also see with folks with a trauma history is that very often they'll have excessive beta as well, right? They're hypervigilant.
Okay.
They're anxious, right? They're processing, they're thinking, they're worrying, they're ruminating. Like that's all fast activity stuff. So you've got all this theta from like subconscious material, and then you've got all this kind of agitation in the system with the beta. And so alpha is kind of the bridge between those two. And so what you often see with folks with trauma is that the alpha is really low. And so the way that we kind of understand that is that it might be a defense mechanism as a way to keep the theta, keep that subconscious material down in the subconscious. Because if there's no bridge for it to get into the conscious mind.
So interesting.
Right. So it's like, it's kind of the way the defense mechanism shows up in brain wave patterns. Is it's like, I don't want to see that stuff. I don't want to think about it. I don't want to feel it. And so one way to do that is just get rid of the alpha bridge. And then it keeps it separate. Now, of course, we know that doesn't actually work. Well, it works some, it works some, but
maybe for a while, and then all of a sudden it doesn't work anymore.
Right. And what I think a lot of therapies do, probably EFT, EMDR, I think certain kinds of neurofeedback, is it helps to build that bridge. And what we're hoping to do is do it in a way that is safe, right? Because as soon as you start building the bridge, stuff is likely to come up.
Yes, absolutely.
And so this is also why relaxation is often tricky for people with a trauma history, because if you relax, alpha comes up and then, now there's a bridge.
There's the bridge. Oh gosh, that makes so much sense. Okay. You did such an awesome job explaining that, because I was like, I have got to ask about this. I totally think that's what's happening, right? Because it's like, we get the body start feeling safer, and then those memories start coming forward. And I always have to warn people, I never know if that's going to happen within 30 seconds or 5 seconds, or if it's going to take a few sessions of getting you into your body and getting regulated and feeling safe enough and comfortable enough that your mind will start opening that stuff up. But I think that is probably exactly what's going on. It makes sense.
Yeah. And, and I think it's necessary for healing, right? Like it's necessary to have that bridge. But it's also scary. There's a reason that your system's trying to keep it separate. So again, it goes back to that informed consent thing, like you were just talking about, like letting people know, right? That it's like stuff might come up here, and I don't know what that's going to look like. And, so are you good with that? And what's the plan if things do come up? And so, and I've had clients where we saw this pattern in their brain, and I saw it. They hadn't even told me they had a trauma history, but I saw this pattern and I said, hmm. And so I asked, and I said, so it may not be, but I'm just curious. So I asked if they had a trauma history, and they burst into tears, and, and it was like, okay. And so I said, well, we can do this work. We can kind of build this alpha up. It could be difficult. I don't know what's going to happen. And so I told him, I said, I want you to think about it for a minute, take as much time as you want, and let me know if you feel like this is a good time to do that work. And the person came back like a week later and said, I'm not ready.
Yeah.
And it was like, okay. It's like, good, right? Like, it's good that you can identify that, right? That it's like, but I feel like that's where it's important for us as, professionals to kind of let people know that, so that they have a choice, right?
Yeah.
So they don't get flooded and they're not expecting it,
Yeah. Yeah. I think, it doesn't happen very often, but I have had a few people where even though they came in like fully aware and trauma informed, and they were like, I am ready to get rid of this stuff. It's just it can be so much. It can be just so intense that they don't, that you can't know until you experience it, what it's going to feel like. And I've had them go, I gotta just back away for a little bit. And, absolutely understandable. But I think, as you described, it's like, if we don't have the bridge, but that stuff is still there, it's still kind of
it still influences things.
still influencing things. Yeah. Maybe talk about that a little bit.
Well, I mean, we know that actually most of our behaviors and feelings are driven by subconscious stuff. Our conscious mind is really not driving the bus, 95% of the time. It's mostly subconscious stuff that's driving the bus. Old scripts, old stories, old narratives that are influencing how we see the world, how we see ourselves, how we interact. And so even though we want to keep that stuff separate because it's painful, it's really what's driving the bus. It's really what's dictating how we engage with the world. And so if we don't look at it and address it, then we're kind of like, we don't have a choice, really. It's like you're kind of like running on these old scripts and you don't really get to choose.
Right. You think you're choosing, but it's not. It's just an automatic behavior coming from deeper inside.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's like that iceberg metaphor thing, it's like, the tip of the surface, what you see above the surface is really only just a tiny, tiny, tiny little piece of what's really going on.
Tiny, itty bitty. Okay. So helpful. I'm going to take us back to, were we on the fourth style already? Yeah. Oh, wait, let me ask you really quickly. And I think we just covered this, but so contraindications for the loving kindness part of it.
Yeah. Interestingly, there's two things. One is if somebody is in an active depression, it sounds contradictory. It's like, wait a minute, wouldn't this be great for somebody with active depression? Yes and no. Yes, of course it would be good for them, right? But most people who are in an active depression, this is way too far away from where they are in the moment. And they have a really hard time accessing this. And so it's just frustrating.
Yeah.
And almost kind of a reminder of how disconnected from those feelings they are.
Yes. Okay.
It's like, can you find something to be appreciative for? And it's like, no.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, okay. So, for somebody who's in an active depression, we actually recommend starting with focus. Like learning to shift your attention away from some of those negative things, right? To something neutral. Like that's a great first step. And kind of getting some stability in your attention. And then, maybe doing some positive psychology kinds of things, right? Kind of like lightweight.
Kind of slowly amp it up because it's just too far of a jump, right?
Right. It's like you're way over here and it's like, okay, go here. And it's like, I can't do that, right?
Yeah. And then again, it's like people, then they're frustrated, pissed, shameful. What's wrong with me? Even more depressed.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So very often if somebody's really struggling with mood, we will kind of step away from that. Also, I should just mention too that we've actually found, of all the styles that are triggering for people with a trauma history, open heart is actually the one that gets people the most.
Interesting.
It is interesting, and it's not what I would have predicted. And I think the reason for that is because if you tune into any feelings, whether they're tender feelings or not, it often opens the door for other feelings as well. Grief, loss, stuff like that.
Yeah.
And so sometimes it can be challenging for people.
Wait, I am so glad you brought that up, because I talk to people about this all the time, right? Where it's like, if we suppress our negative, so-called negative emotions, we bring the good ones down with it. It's really hard to only suppress that side. And so when people are like, I'm having a hard time feeling anything, I have to kind of remind them. And I think you just described that they're kind of all like stuck together, and it's hard to pull out only the good ones. And then you start trying to, like, drags in the other stuff too.
Yep.
That is really interesting. All right, so let's move on to the fourth style. And then
Okay.
I don't want to keep you over time unless you have time, but I really want to talk about the ketamine treatments that you're working on too.
Yeah. So I'll do the fourth style quickly, so that we can talk about psychedelics and ketamine.
Yes, we gotta talk about the psychedelics.
So quiet mind is the fourth style, and it's the stereotype of meditation, right?
This is the kind that drives me crazy, by the way.
Yeah, it's the kind
which is why I need to do it.
That's actually probably true, right? But
totally.
It drives most people crazy, right? Because they get the idea is like, oh, sit down and empty your mind. And it's like, okay, like, how am I supposed to do that?
That makes me just want to punch someone in the face. And then I have to start tapping because I'm angry.
Yeah.
Sad but true. Yeah.
So one reason I like covering this last is because you can already see that 3 of the styles don't involve having nothing going on. You're actually doing something.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's helpful to point out to people too. It's like, you don't have to completely empty your mind in order to get benefit. There's other ways to meditate. And now there are some benefits to quiet mind, right? And we try to talk to people about having a quieter mind, which also makes it like a little bit of a lower hanging fruit kind of a thing. If you're just going for like complete emptiness, that's really, really challenging. However, if the noise in your mind is at an 8, can you bring it down to a 5? Like, that's significant. That's useful, right? Yeah, there might still be some chatter up there. There might still be some stuff going on, but can you learn to reduce that, right? And once you learn how to get it to a 5, can you get it to a 4, right? So it's, again, kind of this developmental process of like, you don't have to have a completely empty mind to get benefit.
I think that's so helpful.
Yeah. And, and it is about, and there's tricky, sneaky strategies that people can use, because if you do something like Zen or something like that, where it's just like, okay, just sit. That's what my Zen teacher used to, all the time. You'd ask him a question and he'd say, sit more.
That makes me just need to start tapping. I know. I'm being playful with this because I've come so far, and I actually can sit down and just like, I can do that now. But not if I'm like dysregulated at all, I just find it to be so irritating and not helpful at all. Just sit.
Right. And so there are strategies, and not going down this rabbit hole, but for instance, if you direct your attention toward the absence of something. So for instance, you could do a modified body scan, and instead of paying attention to the body, and there's guided meditations out there like this in a system called open focus. But if you tell people like, can you notice the space between your right thumb and your right index finger?
You know what? You're right. That kind of meditation totally works for me.
Yeah, because you're giving your mind something to do. But what's it paying attention to? It's paying attention to nothing. It's paying attention to space.
Right.
And when you
Give
pay
the dog a
attention,
bone. I can pay
right?
attention to space.
Yeah, the brain's like, I want to pay attention to something. It's like, great, here, pay attention to this.
Yes.
What is it? It's like, it's
Okay.
nothing. And so the brain gets really quiet because there's nothing there. So you can use tricky strategies like that, right? Where it's like, you don't have to just sit and do nothing and somehow magically empty your brain. But those practices are really good and they're really powerful. And again, because you're learning to sort of quiet down all of that internal chatter that is usually what causes us problems, how we're talking to ourselves and what's happening internally. And so if you can learn to minimize that, then you've sort of got more room, for something new to happen that's not the old stuff again, so but again, there's other strategies, there's other ways to do that. But, quiet mind is also one of the best strategies for things like chronic pain.
Okay.
So that's often an area where we tend to use that.
And what's the contraindication for this one? Who should maybe be cautious with this one?
I mean, really, so again, people who have kind of a traditional style of ADHD or depression, I think should just be thoughtful about using it judiciously. And I say it that way because this is really increasing slow brain waves is what this practice is doing. And that's kind of what you already see with people with traditional ADHD and with depression is too much slow brain waves. And so it's like, well, do you really want to be increasing slow brain waves more? Maybe not, right? So this is where we think about things like, well, if somebody has a slow brain, ADHD, depression, maybe you want to do something that's going to speed your brain up. So focus, open heart, right?
Yes.
That's more
Okay.
activating. And if you've got a really busy brain, which you probably have,
I do,
right? Then, mindfulness, quiet mind, right? Something that's going to sort of like downshift that system.
Okay, so I do have a really busy mind, but I can also be one of those people that's kind of like tired but wired. What tell me what to do when I'm in that state. I mean, I can be all kinds of different places, but I find that to be a very frustrating state, the tired but wired.
So yeah, so tell me more about that. Tired but wired.
It's like I'm like
You're like a little
exhausted
kid.
and I feel heavy. Yeah, I'm like, meh. Exactly. But like at the same time, there's like, I kind of feel like triggered a little bit, like, a little bit shaky, or like my heart will be racing. And it's just it's like you almost feel depressed and like heavy, but at the same time, sort of anxious. What the heck is wrong with me, Jeff?
Yeah. I mean, and this starts to get into some interesting territory, right? Where even though we've created kind of this categorization process, and so that we can try to go like, oh, this one might be better or whatever. The reality is that most people probably need to work with more than one strategy, right? And so, probably there's going to be some sort of combination for you, or depending on the day, right? You do a lot of self-care kinds of things, and you do yoga and you meditate and you tap and you do all kinds of other stuff. I suspect your diet is pretty good,
Well, most of the time, although I just went off the rails, but I'm back on track as of like 3 days ago. I'm back on track, but normally, yes.
So, you've got a lot of, skills, you've done a lot of work. And so, very often for people who are kind of in that situation, they have to kind of use this categorization a little bit differently, almost like a peak performance kind of approach, where kind of day to day, moment to moment, you're kind of looking at yourself and going like, okay, what do I need right now to get a little bit more balanced, right? Like, okay, my anxiety's ramped up. Okay, well, what does that mean? Okay, oh, I need to bring myself down. What could I use, right? Or it's like, oh my God, I'm totally scattered, or I've, and so kind of looking at day to day, moment to moment, and, imagining that it's like your level of dysregulation is probably not really that bad, right? No. Like, it's like, okay, here's midline. It's like, oh, you're kind of moving like this.
And
And
so I'm hyper, I mean, I'm sure you're the same, like after doing this work for so long, like hyper aware of where I am on that scale, right?
right. And so, I mean, we all do this anyway, right? Like, it's like, oh, I'm feeling down. Oh, I'm going to go get a coffee. Like, we already do this. We see where we're at and like, oh, what do I need to get a little bit more balanced, right? And I need to go take a walk. I need to go, I need some caffeine. I need
Mm-hmm.
whatever. And so it's like just using meditation is another one of those like tools, right? To like, what would help me kind of get a little bit more balanced today? Because the reality is none of us stay stagnant, right? I
Yeah.
mean, hormones fluctuate, stress in our life, phase of the moon,
Right.
events in the world. I mean, there's always things changing that are going to put us off balance one way or another.
Totally. I'm like all in on the solar flares right now too. And I'm convinced that they're making us all a little more neurotic.
Probably. I haven't been paying attention to solar flares, but I would totally believe it.
It's fascinating. We're like in this huge cycle where the sun starts spitting out all these solar flares, and it's enough that it like affects the magnetic, the magnetic geomagnetic storm stuff. Why can't I spit this out? I read about it all the time. But yeah, my theory is that because if they're strong enough, they can knock out the electrical grid. And I guess recently there was a storm big enough on the sun that had it happened on the part of the sun that was facing us, it probably would have knocked out like all the satellites, all of our electrical grid. And I'm like, there's no way, after talking about the brain waves, right, that isn't affecting our electrical body. So I think I mean, I'm fascinated by that kind of thing, but I think a lot of the even more subtle fluctuations with the sun are probably affecting our magnetic field internally. And
I'm with you.
I don't know, it's just a theory, but that's what I'm like obsessed with right now.
I'm with you. I'm totally with you.
My husband keeps making fun of me. He's like, oh, it's not the solar flares, Kelly. I'm like, you don't know. We just had a big one yesterday.
And I think some people are more sensitive to those things than others, just like environmental toxins and things, some people are really sensitive to that, and other people, it doesn't seem to bother them at all.
Do you think that maybe that those people, it doesn't bother, like it really doesn't bother them, or are they just dissociated and not really feeling their body?
I mean, probably both. I think in some cases people just don't tune in. And I think for whatever reason, some people can like process that,
those
toxins, right? Like, I mean, if we think of the equivalent, like in the body, some people's livers, you can abuse the hell out of it for your whole life and it's fine.
Right.
It's like,
true.
Okay. You hear about those people, they're 100 years old and they've been drinking, whiskey every day of their life and eating red meat. And it's like smoking and they're like, they're fine. Right.
Yes.
It's like, how is that possible? Right. It's
I know. Super liver.
And so I think some people just their system is able to process that, those toxins in a way that, doesn't have as big of an influence. And then there's other people that are just, hypersensitive, right? And like the smallest fluctuation throws them off track. Who knows?
Yeah, who knows? So we've got about 5 minutes. I'm not sure what your schedule looks like. Can we talk for just a couple of minutes about the ketamine and like what's going on in that area for people that don't know anything about it? I'm like just crazy fascinated with the psilocybin and the ketamine. I would love to hear what you're up to in that department.
Yeah. So I've been kind of working with psychedelics personally and professionally, probably for I don't even know. I mean, personally for 6 or 7 years.
Okay.
Professionally for a few years. And I live in Oregon, which is very liberal in relation to those things. And a few years back, I became a cleric in a peyote church here in Oregon. And, you can use peyote legally if it's within a spiritual context, and at least here. And so that was the way that I was able to work with those medicines at that point. And of course, most people are familiar that Oregon just passed Proposition 109 last year that legalizes therapeutic psilocybin services.
Fantastic.
It's not going to go into effect for they're still trying to figure out all the regulations and all the stuff.
Yeah, I bet that side of it's a nightmare.
Yeah, probably. And so, I'm kind of doing all the educational requirements right now so that when they do start taking applications, I can apply for that and hopefully start offering that. Um, and of course, I think probably most people listening to this are going to be familiar with some of the research coming out, that the research is really overwhelmingly positive, that
Mhm.
psilocybin therapy, MDMA um, therapy looks extremely promising. And particularly if it's used in the context of preparation and integration services, which is what I'm really passionate about, is not just treating this like a magic bullet. You go take 3 grams of mushrooms and somehow that's going to like solve all of your problems.
Right.
And in fact, that's one thing I see here. I mean, again, I'm in a very psychedelic friendly area. And you see people all the time, they go have a big experience, mind blowing. They understand everything and they're calm and relaxed. And then 3 weeks later, they're back doing the exact same stuff they were doing before. And so it's like, it didn't get integrated. The lessons didn't get brought into real life. And so that's what I'm really interested in doing. And so because the other medicines aren't available yet, I've kind of moved into working with ketamine, which, people, most people's awareness of ketamine is like, isn't that a horse tranquilizer?
Right.
Like,
Or they're like, isn't that a street drug?
right. Yes. And yes.
Right.
But actually, it's an analgesic and it's been used with humans and animals for a long time. And it's got a very, it's got a very safe profile. Which makes it really great because, unless you've got a significant heart condition or, blood pressure issue, pretty much anybody can work with ketamine safely. It's different than a traditional psychedelic. It doesn't act the same way in the neurotransmitters and with other things. And so it's often called a dissociative, which is what it's kind of known for, is that ketamine, particularly at a higher dose, sub-anesthetic dose, people tend to have sort of out-of-body experiences, like really where you're disconnected from your physical body. And you can even become disconnected from your personality and from your, and so it's a really interesting medicine in that you can kind of have these experiences of still having a consciousness, but not being connected to all your crap.
So interesting.
And it can be really powerful, right? That experience can be really powerful and really liberating. And so, ketamine therapy is being used all over the place now because it's legal. It has to be done by a physician because it's a medicine, and it's mostly being done in sort of IV clinics where they'll kind of give it to you as an IV drip. And
yeah, we actually have one here now. I'm not sure if you knew that. We have one here in town.
And yeah, and there's I know of somebody in Kansas City who's doing more of a ketamine assisted therapy, thing. And so, some of those IV clinics, I mean, it's interesting because the pharmacology of the medicine itself does seem to have some antidepressant effects. It increases BDNF in the brain, which helps with brain growth. It increases flexibility in the brain. So the pharmacology of it by itself does do something. And usually that's not the final solution because those effects go away. And so that's where the therapy or neurofeedback or meditation or neuromeditation or whatever, tapping, all becomes really important because you've got this window of time, especially the first 72 hours after a session, where your brain is actually really flexible.
After the ketamine treatment? Oh, very cool.
Right. And so it's like, how do we take advantage of that? Right. Like part of the problem that people have is that the brain gets stuck. It gets stuck in these patterns from a brain perspective, we're using the term now, sort of talking about entropy, you know, and so how much flexibility versus rigidity is in your brain. And what all the psychedelics do is increase entropy. It sort of loosens everything up. And so, you know, how do we take advantage of that, right? And say, hey, your brain's kind of relaxed a little bit. Let's get in there.
Right.
And, you know, how do we kind of rework some of this stuff? And so, so the IV clinics, many of them, they're not really doing that second part. They're just kind of providing the ketamine, and that's kind of it. And so you're starting to see more people doing the ketamine assisted therapy aspect, right? Where it's like, how do we build a program around the ketamine? That the ketamine is just a tool, you know, to kind of help us move this along. And so I'm working with a physician up, you know, kind of up the road from me, who's doing IM treatment. So it's still an injection, but it's not IV.
Okay.
It's just a shot in the arm.
I didn't realize you could do that.
You can actually do ketamine just about any way you can get it in your body. Because when it's used like on the party scene, they snort it.
Oh, right. Okay.
And I've got another physician that I work with who will prescribe lozenges. And then the client can then bring it to the office and do it in the office with me. So, you know, I'm not administering it. I'm not prescribing it. I'm just there with them while they're kind of in their experience, and they just let it dissolve in their mouth. Right.
Oh, that's so interesting. How I guess it kicks in pretty quickly if they're taking it when they get to the office.
I mean, because it takes a minute to dissolve. Right. So like IM like hits you quick, right? It's like a minute and a half and you're in. But the lozenges take, you know, they take 15, 20 minutes to dissolve. And then, you know, so it's kind of a slower kind of a process, and it's a little bit of a different experience because of that. But the whole thing only lasts like an hour, which is also kind of nice, right? Because if you're doing psilocybin, it's like you're in for 6 hours.
Right. You got to be committed.
You got to be committed, you know, and if it's MDMA, it might even be longer, right?
Wow.
And so it's nice to have these kind of like 1 hour, hour and a half, you know, where it's like, oh, okay, you're kind of more or less back to normative consciousness.
Loosened up, but still there. Yeah.
Right.
I like that. I mean, because 6 hours, that's like a whole day commitment, you know, if not longer. So who are you seeing that benefits the most from these ketamine treatments?
I mean, it's being used mostly for treatment-resistant depression.
Okay, that's what I was thinking.
You know, so people who have tried 2 or more medications that were unsuccessful and, you know, have been in therapy and whatever, right? Like, you know, and what we're seeing is that very often people will they'll do multiple ketamine sessions, right? So it's not just a one and done. So they might do 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 ketamine sessions kind of spread out over a period of time. And I find that to be really powerful because some people, they do it once and it seems to click something and they're great. But then I've seen other people where it's taken 8 sessions and then something clicks. And, you know, personally, I think it's the level of defensiveness in the system. You know, how much defensiveness do we have to kind of like burn through? But again, that's where I feel like the other therapeutic approaches as a support while they're kind of going through this process becomes really important. You know, how do we help increase psychological flexibility? You know, how do we help integrate their experiences so that they can take the meaning and the insight and bring it into real life? You know, real life in air quotes.
Right. Right. So, okay. And then what about also going back to the psilocybin? And then I promise I'll let you get back to your life. Who's benefiting the most from that? Or who, like, if someone's like, I want to try something like this, you know, who's going to benefit from that?
Again, research has been mostly with depression. But there's also research with anxiety, with obsessive compulsive disorder, with PTSD, with people that have terminal illnesses. And so end of life kind of anxiety kinds of stuff, addictions.
Mhm.
There's actually research kind of all over the board, which again is interesting, right? Because you got to be careful not to look at it and go like, oh, it cures everything. And it's like,
Mhm.
within a context, right? And it's not that it cures everything, but if we think of most mental health concerns as being a problem of the brain becoming overly rigid and stuck in certain unhealthy patterns. And so these medicines are really loosening things up so that you really have the opportunity to make significant changes. And so it makes sense in that regard of why it would be useful for so many things, right?
Mhm.
It's sort of a power tool, you know.
So on like the peak performance side of things, it sounds like if you've just like been working on yourself for a long time and you are just stuck in a rut in like one specific thought pattern or, addiction or whatever, this sounds like it might be a good option as far as like lubricating that so that you can go deeper and get in there. What are your thoughts on microdosing?
It's interesting because the things keep going back and forth on microdosing about like, oh, it's just a placebo, oh, it doesn't do anything, oh, it makes you more creative,
Mm-hmm.
and what I've seen outside of kind of research, right? Because the research is all over the place and is not very good at this point. Um, I did a miniature little case study with 3 people, measured their brains. They did a microdose. I measured their brains 40 minutes later, and all 3 of them, their brains changed significantly, but they
Wow.
changed in different ways.
Ooh, interesting. Wait, so
Yeah,
how
it
long did you do this for with
was
them?
like after 40 minutes after they took it.
Oh, so
So
like one dose, 40 minutes later, you
yeah,
looked at the brains. Okay.
right. So just wanted to see like, okay, because some of the things coming out say, oh, it doesn't really do anything. It's just placebo effect or whatever. And it's like, well, when you see that the brain changes significantly, that's not placebo. Something is happening.
Right. Right.
And and I think, at least from the little mini study that we did, the fact that different people's brains change different ways, my theory is that when you take a microdose, it's more of an adaptogen.
That was just what I was getting ready to say. It sounds
Yeah.
exactly like that. Yeah.
And so it's adapting to what you need. Whereas if you take a big dose, it's like, well, everybody, it's going to look the same. I can hook up 10 people and the brain's going to do the same thing because, you took a big, massive dose.
Yeah.
But with a tiny dose, I think it's balancing things out. And, um, and so, the other thing I would say with microdosing, just from talking with a lot of people who have experimented with that, is that it seems like it's very individualized, that you read something that says, oh, do this much every 3rd day, and it's like, for some people that's too much, and for some people that's not enough. And
Right.
there's like this huge experimentation that I've seen people have to do to kind of find what really works for them.
Mm-hmm.
um, and so it makes it hard, right? Because you can't say, oh, here's what you should do. It's like,
Yeah, that is hard as a clinician, right? To just be like, well, go play with it and see what
right.
happens. And
And of course, and I can't recommend any of that, right? Because it's
right.
still, it's still illegal, and I'm not
Therapeutic
prescribing
use only,
anything.
right?
I can't even recommend it therapeutically.
Oh.
You know,
Hmm.
uh, not yet. Ketamine I can, but the other
Gotcha.
stuff is still. So in Oregon, psychedelics have been decriminalized. Like, you're not going to get in trouble if you get caught with any psychedelics, but
Mm-hmm.
you they're not legal. You can't go to the store
Gotcha.
and buy them or whatever. So
Yeah.
um,
Oh man, I just think that world is so fascinating. And I'm like still kind of pissed that the research that was being done in the 70s got shut down. I mean, that's like a whole different, I could talk to you for so long about that. Um, but I'm so excited. I mean, I am just so excited because I think there's so many people out there that I mean, they need it. Like, they're not going to be the people like you and I that are going to like do these deep dives into all this personal development work in the same way that we have like over all the years, but they still need to feel better quickly.
Yep.
And it just seems like the way that you described that, where it just opens things up, lubricates things so that we can go deeper. And then if you have someone like you there to help integrate it, I mean, I'm so excited about where it's going. And I just want it to hurry up
Yeah.
and get
Yeah.
there.
We're getting there. It's
Yeah.
getting closer and closer. You know,
Yeah.
I mean, the good news is that, you know, ketamine is available now, and, you know, there are more and more clinics kind of offering this and starting to see that having supportive services is an important element of that. So for me, that's encouraging, right?
Yes,
It's like
definitely.
we at least have a way to move into this.
Yeah, definitely. So what can you like, do you still have a license here in Missouri, or are you only licensed? You're just in Oregon.
Yeah.
I was going to say,
license-
maybe you can like travel here and hit up one of these ketamine clinics and do some of your, you know, your journeys with people, but
they come out here.
yeah, maybe I will. I mean, I'm just so curious about it.
Come on out.
I mean, yeah, I'm just so curious about it. But if people want to know more about your work, neuromeditation, the 4 styles, where do you want to send them as far as to get more information or to work with you, or to get online?
Yeah. Really, our website is the place to go. It's just, you know, www.neuromeditationinstitute.com. Kind of a big, somebody stole neuromeditation.com before I could get it. And,
Oh,
you know, yeah. So, you know, Neuromeditation Institute is where
gotcha.
you'll find us. And pretty much all of our stuff's on there.
And you, like you said, so you've been training therapists in this technique also, or in these styles. So can they find a therapist that's working with that? Yeah. And I'm assuming, do you have some people here in Missouri, in
We
Columbia?
actually don't, believe it or not. It's the funniest thing. I was just thinking about that.
Oh man.
Like, we've got providers all over the country, in Canada and Poland and Germany.
Oh,
And
Jeff,
nobody in Missouri.
okay. Well, that's super cool that you're reaching the rest of the world. I can't believe you don't have anybody here in Missouri. We're going to have to manifest that for sure.
Yeah. So maybe we can get you on board.
Oh man. Could I do it? I mean,
Yeah.
I could still learn the styles. I don't have to be
No,
like
you don't-
licensed psychologist or
No.
anything, right?
No.
Okay. Yeah, that's something we could talk about. Very interesting. For sure. For sure.
I'm going to have
Thank
to run
you.
because we've got a research thing going
Yeah,
on
I
here.
know. Thank you so much for your time. I so appreciate you. And it's been so beautiful to connect again.
Yeah. It was good talking to you. Thanks.
All right.
guys.
See you, Jeff.
Bye-bye.